This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
Remember those "we get it, you vape" memes?
Nope.
You don't? That used to be like a thing, I think, ages ago when vapes kind of first became a thing, and there would be like a big cloud and it's like, "we get it, you vape." I don't really know. I don't really understand. I don't really remember why the memes were funny, but it was like a thing.
Right. Something that clearly wasn't a vape cloud, but you were pretending it was a vape cloud, and that was the joke.
Maybe. And I think it was just that like people who vaped were really into the fact that they vaped. I think that was
the vape guy became a thing, right? A way of being. A new guy just dropped, vape guy.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there were vaping conventions, and the guys were really good at smoking, like making like smoking in impressive ways. I've never quite bought into it, to be honest. My major memory of vape is when they started becoming popular. There was a joke that spread through the world of comedy, which is vaping looks like you just had sex with a robot. Or the vape looks like the robot that the cigarette that a robot smokes after having sex.
The cigarette that a robot smokes after having sex. Okay, yeah. Where did that joke come from?
I don't know. I think it was a meme, and then some people did in their stand up. I just felt like I saw it a lot. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't heard that one. Comedy, hey.
It's a funny old business.
We are doing an episode about vaping because it's interesting and there's some stuff happening in the regulatory space. This is serious danger. You know that, patrons. This one's just for you. We're not an official Greens Party podcast because who knows what the Greens think about vaping. It's kind of hard to say, to be honest. But we can talk about what we think with the help of the Green Institute who make this podcast possible, and Michael the Griffin, our producer. And then later on in the show, I have an interview that I did with Dr. Colin Mendelsohn, who's a former GP specialising in smoking cessation and now has kind of dedicated a bunch of his time to advocating for tobacco harm reduction, including access to vapes as like a smoking cessation device. So, Tom, you're not a vapist?
A vape supremacist. I have not vaped. I have occasionally over the years recreationally smoked. I feel like I never quite got into any sort of addictive vibe. There were a few moments when, for whatever reason, it was my turn to during periods of stress, and I was quite a social smoker. But the attraction to vaping has never quite landed with me. For some reason, I need actual fire and flame in my hands to make it interesting.
But even though you haven't even tried it.
I think I've tried it once or twice. I did it on stage the other week at the Sydney Writers' Festival as a joke because the topic was the future is still worth waiting for. We were the negative team, so we dressed in like tracksuit pants and hoodies and just started vaping and, like as if we'd given up. And so we did this big like sucked on a vape and blew out the smoke.
Funny.
It was really funny. We lost.
Yeah.
But so yes, and that was fine. But I guess, I don't know. For whatever reason, it's the physical experience just doesn't give me whatever the hell smoking did. And I've never been a vapor.
Okay.
I'm very annoyed because if you are a social smoker and you just like cigarettes, whenever you're in a social situation now, you're like, oh, anyone got a cigarette? And of course, all the people that normally had cigarettes are just vapor. Yeah.
That's very true. Yeah. Do you understand the current, like what the rules are around vaping in this country?
I kind of tried to get my head around it a little bit when I saw these announcements, these new reforms introduced by the Labor government. My understanding is that at the moment you need a prescription to get a vape because under the law, vapes are viewed as this kind of device to help people try and quit smoking. That's not the reality, but that's sort of like the presentation of what it is. And they're trying to tighten people's access to vapes even further, including banning the importation of certain vapes and making it harder to get a prescription.
So you need a prescription to get nicotine. So to get a nicotine vape, which is, because that's sold as a smoking cessation device.
Right.
In theory, you can buy non-nicotine vapes though.
Right.
But the fact is that in reality, there's this like very thriving black market. I think the majority of people are buying these disposable vapes from, convenience stores and all those shops that you see around the place that sell vapes that actually do when they've looked at them and analysed them, a lot of them do have nicotine.
Oh, they secretly have nicotine. Okay.
Yeah,
gotcha.
I think most of them, and very kind of wide ranges of nicotine. Like some of them have heaps, some of them might just have like a tiny amount, but it's very much like, I think the vast majority of vapes that people use, as I understand it, probably come from the black market and are effectively just like unregulated.
Okay.
And those are all the, yeah.
And there's some people smoking weed out of them too, right? You can get weed vapes.
Yeah, you can get, because I think you can get the non-disposable ones where you can then get an oil or like a liquid. I don't know if it's an oil, but a liquid that you you insert into the vape, and that can include cannabis ones. So I think, but the problem is that, the prescription system, which was introduced in, I believe, like probably late 2020 or maybe early 2021, so quite recently, following this parliamentary inquiry into vaping and tobacco harm reduction. And that's when I think they introduced the prescription system and banned nicotine apart from prescription.
Right.
But it's really hard to get one. It's hard to get a prescription. And so that's why then even for people who genuinely want it to stop smoking, will just end up going to the black market anyway. And so there's like this thriving black market. My mum had an experience with this where she has been like, she's been smoking since, God, I don't know, probably she was like 13 or 14, really struggled to quit. She's tried everything. And she tried to get a prescription from her doctor, and he literally like laughed in her face and was incredibly rude to her and just refused to give her one. And so she was like, okay, well, I'll just go home and buy one on the internet.
Oh, God. Okay. And I suppose another element of this conversation is that vaping is quite popular amongst the kiddies. Young people are sort of taking to vaping quite regularly, and obviously people, if they're starting vaping, undermines the idea, the presentation that this is a device or something that can help people stop smoking if people are taking up vaping.
And this is what I, talked to Colin about in the interview. Like, I think that probably the biggest factor right now in the public discourse around vapes and how we deal with them, how the government should deal with them, is about this like incredible alarm around children and young people vaping. Right. And it's true, like I've spoken to some of my friends are teachers, and they're like, it is a huge problem in schools. Like just so many kids are vaping. And I guess the fear is that these are kids who wouldn't have otherwise smoked. They might not have smoked cigarettes, but they're taking up vaping because they think that it's harmless or because it's so accessible, which it is. Like these stores will just sell a vape to anyone. But then there is kind of, like there are questions around how widespread that actually is, and whether those kids who do take up vaping on a consistent basis, like it's, I think the evidence is that like it might be more common for kids to try a vape than they might have tried a cigarette, but to actually take it up or develop an addiction or take it up on an ongoing basis, it would probably map over the same kids who might have who would have been likely to, take more risks or to take up smoking effectively.
Okay. Like fidget spinners.
Yeah. Sorry?
Like fidget spinners. Everyone tries it to look cool.
Sure. Yeah. It's pretty much the same.
Probably not a good analogy. But are there people vaping with stuff that has no nicotine in it, that's just sort of flavored smoke, that just enjoy the habit of like blowing out smoke? Okay.
It sounds like it's kind of rare. Like it sounds like because a lot of these, like they just import, I think like a lot of vapes are like imported from China, and just you kind of don't really know how much nicotine's, and there's probably nicotine in them, even if you don't know that there is. But there are questions around how harmful nicotine is, because when you think about it, you can buy nicotine gum in the supermarket. Like a kid could go and buy nicotine gum already. Right. So, it's, obviously it's very addictive, and I'm not saying that kids should be taking up vaping, but it's an interesting question. I think like that's why I personally have struggled to know how we address this and what I think about it and what the approach should be. And you've clearly seen that from the Greens as well. I think like their response in late 2020, like when this inquiry happened and there were the recommendations around a prescription model, their response, I think Rachel Seward was the spokesperson at the time, and they supported a precautionary approach. They expressed doubt that vaping has an overall positive benefit. And they supported they supported banning nicotine-containing vapes except for by prescription.
Mm.
They particularly raised concerns about the involvement of Big Tobacco and Big Tobacco kind of just like transferring its efforts to lobbying for vaping because they're kind of just like moving on to the next. I mean, it's interesting. It kind of, you see like all these Colin and gas corporations just like moving into renewables. Does that necessarily make us be like renewables are bad? Not no. Quite, but it obviously it kind of gives you that feeling where you're like, is this sus? And that's why I reckon I was like, I don't know what to believe because I don't know whether I really believe like a lot of the stuff around like, oh yeah, whether vaping, I don't really know whether vaping is like super harmful or whether it's okay.
It's so weird, right? Because you would have thought there is a different case with tobacco, okay? Because the tobacco companies for decades deliberately denied and avoided the actual health advice
now.
We already know. But it's like we're repeating that now. Surely don't we have enough knowledge as to definitively say like the health impacts of vaping? But it does seem like that's also contested territory.
I think apparently not like, but I mean, I think it's like it's the case with kind of every, medicine or substance that you don't know what we don't know what the impacts of long COVID or of COVID are going to be in 10, 20 years. We have to kind of wait and see. We can see what's happening now. Like you can really only see what's happening. And there are stories about, there are all these terrible stories about kids coughing up black or people dying and you look at their lungs and they're shriveled up like a raisin and it's because of vaping. But I think that evidence is so nascent. Like it's really unclear. And I don't know. I mean, people like Colin Mendelsohn, they focus a lot on, they're quite convinced that vaping is at least very, very significantly less harmful than tobacco smoking.
Right. Okay.
And I'm like, okay, sure. But I also think from a political perspective, if the Greens were to take a position on this, I don't think that's the focus in the same way that when we talk about drugs, even cannabis, for example, I don't think that the angle of being like, well, it's just a plant and actually cannabis like isn't that dangerous and, or any other drugs, like trying to rank them on the scale of most dangerous to least dangerous and a, quote unquote proportionate response to that. I think like what convinced me that we should be taking, like that we should, have a legalized, regulated model of vaping is because that's what I believe about all drugs. All drugs,
yes, totally, yes. I mean, this is regulation of these products is crucial to decriminalization, legalization, because as we know, a flat-out prohibition, banning people from accessing this stuff does not work. The black market immediately pops up, and that's way less safe for people. So regulation from everything, something like plain packaging, which I'm happy to support for cigarettes and stuff.
Yeah.
That's fine. As opposed to say, my association with the politics of vaping is that crazy people from the IPA who are all anti-regulation were very pro-vaping very early on. Okay, so that raises my hackles.
And the Nationals and stuff, right? Like I think, all our political enemies are like pro-vape, which is so ironic because, they would absolutely have a go at us for our policies on other drugs and for wanting to legalize cannabis because prohibition doesn't work. And we want to take a harm reduction approach there. And they're like, you fucking hippies. And then when it comes to vaping, though, they're like, hey, prohibition's not working. Like,
isn't it funny, too? Because like vaping doesn't change the way you feel in any way, unlike other drugs that might expand your mind and see through the fucking bullshit of the capitalist system, man. Whereas like just smoking just kills you slowly over time. So this is a question
like there's a debate about, I mean, my friends who are straight edge were like, can we vape? I mean, I guess apparently because most of them contain nicotine, maybe not. But I know a lot of straight edge people who would like vape because it's not meant to contain any drugs. But it would feel strange. I don't know. But the Greens position has clearly kind of, I think it's like it's changing. I think that, federally they've been a little bit quiet. I haven't really seen anything from Jordan Steele-John's office, who would presumably be the spokesperson now. But the New South Wales Greens just this year brought a proposal to the election to legalise and regulate vaping. And they basically were saying that a lot of those restrictions like that do apply to tobacco should apply to vapes. So, plain packaging and warning labels, and you can't advertise them. And they would want limits on like nicotine levels, obviously, and only available to over 18s, kind of behind the counter sort of thing. So that I would I kind of suspect that maybe the federal Greens are moving in that direction but haven't like come out with it yet. But that's just purely me kind of guessing on vibes. But I assume, you know, we are going to have to take a position on it soon because we now have this proposal from the federal Labor government to, you know, quote unquote, crack down even further to ban all disposable vapes, to ban the import of non-prescription vaping products, including ones that don't contain nicotine. And they say that they'll make it easier to get a prescription for vapes because they'll allow all GPs to prescribe it instead of like just certain GPs. But the consensus among people like Dr. Mendelsohn is that probably just wouldn't help it anyway because doctors are just so reluctant to prescribe it. But yeah,
how's it? So if you're a 13-year-old, if you want to try and stop 13-year-old kids vaping, okay, so in theory, a 13-year-old kid goes to his GP, says, "I want to vape, I want to start vaping."
Oh, I don't know.
Obviously, that's not going to happen. And then, so of course, they immediately go to the already existing, and my understanding is thriving black market.
That's right. I don't quite understand. How they would. And I guess what they've said is, it'll be up to states to figure out how they then enforce this new hard ban. And maybe they're like, well, maybe it'll be easier to enforce because it's a clear ban on you wouldn't have to like test to see if there's nicotine or not. You just be like, well, this is a disposable vape, so it's illegal.
And would cops be stopping people on the street who are vaping or kids and say, hey,
that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, who knows? The classic, like, I thought this was so funny, but that from that very moving Mac housing speech that I'm sure we all know and love by now, where I had someone come into my office crying, sobbing about not being able to pay the rent. And then Michaelia Cash updates on Twitter at Very Normal Man had made this tweet that was like the picture of Max in Parliament. And it says, and we had one young man come into our office the other day crying, saying, "Max, they're going to take my vapes away. They're going to take my vapes away." So is that what's happening? We'll find out. Let's chat to Dr. Colin Mendelsohn. Here's my interview with him.
And now, finally, it's time to put this sick new vape to the test. You all want to know what I'm about? I'm about chasing the fattest clouds and ripping the fattest vapes. Welcome to the Vape Nation. Baby, you smart. Vape Nation.
So Dr. Colin Mendelsohn, he's a former GP with a special interest in smoking cessation and I'd say a bit of an expert and advocate in tobacco harm reduction. And we wanted to chat to you particularly with the new federal government proposals around cracking down on vaping, as they've put it, about whether this is the right way to go about it and what kind of myths are running around vaping and what approach you would like to see. So thanks so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Emerald.
All right. So I think probably big question to start, because I think this is something that you've been dealing with at the moment. You've done interviews elsewhere and they've referred to you as like a controversial person with links to the vaping industry or a big tobacco shill. So are you funded or connected in any way to big tobacco or e-cigarettes?
Absolutely not. I've never taken funding from big tobacco or e-cigarettes companies. I'm not linked to either. I'm only controversial because I am noisy, and there are a lot of people who agree with my views, including the Royal College of Physicians and the New Zealand government, the Public Health England. Just recently, we sent a letter to the Health Minister signed by 43 leading Australian tobacco control and addiction experts who agree with me. So maybe we're all controversial, but this is not the mainstream view in Australia, but it's certainly a widely held view, the views that I have.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing that, I just had a quick chat with my co-host Tom about, that it does feel like even in the harm reduction space, there might be a bit of a lag when it comes to vaping, and people who would advocate against a prohibitionist stance on other drugs are still kind of hesitant around that when it comes to vaping. And that is, I think, really being reflected in the regulatory approach that we're seeing from government. So right now we've got this proposal from the federal government that would basically ban all disposable vapes, all non-prescription vaping products, says they would widen access via prescriptions, but there's some concern it won't necessarily do that. How is it? How do you think this would change the way that vapes are actually accessed now in practice?
Yeah. Look, at the moment, we have that model where the government's decided that vapes are medicines and require a prescription. So you have to find a doctor who'll give you one, which is very hard. You have to find a pharmacist who'll dispense them, and there are very few. And vapers have said, look, and smokers, this is too hard. We're not doing this. We're not going to the doctor for something, the alternative we can buy at the local petrol station. And so over 90% of vapes in Australia are sold and used illegally. Cigarettes are freely available everywhere. So since this original crackdown 18 months ago, the black market's just gone out of control, and the current model that's been developed just hasn't worked. And what the health minister's now planning is just to double down on that further. Well, I would have thought the message was fairly clear that this model isn't going to work, and doubling down further is just going to make it worse. Basically, prohibition we know doesn't work. It doesn't reduce the long-term supply of drugs for which there's a significant demand. The black market finds ways, people find ways to get these products, and they just get them through illegal channels, which are less safe, more costly, introduce all sorts of criminal issues. And I think we're just going down that path further in spite of all the evidence from past experiences with approaches like this.
And I think a lot of probably where a lot of this is coming from is this very intense concern around children in particular and young people vaping. And I'm curious to know, as you say, and I think everyone has seen it, there's been a massive explosion in the supply and use of vapes, mostly from convenience stores and a lot of them on the black market in the last year or so. Who exactly is vaping? What are the stats? What do we know about how many young people are vaping? How many people are using it to quit versus just for fun? Do we know that kind of thing?
Yeah, look, we've got a pretty good idea. Look, we're constantly being told there's a youth vaping epidemic, but that is greatly exaggerated. There's a lot of experimentation by kids. That's what kids do. They try these things and they experiment and they use them for a short time, then they stop. But frequent vaping by kids who've never smoked is very uncommon. So in a whole range of international studies, they've found that less than 2% of kids who've never smoked vape frequently. And by frequently, depends on the study, it means either daily, more than 20 days a month, or weekly. For example, in England, in their official data of 11 to 15-year-olds, less than 1% of non-smokers vape more than once weekly. So the important thing is to break down that headline figure of so many kids are vaping to what it really means. Most of the frequent vaping is in kids who have smoked or who currently smoke. And for many of them, vaping is actually beneficial. So, that's got to be taken into account in terms of, significance of this uptick in vaping.
So when you say it's beneficial, because I guess the argument has been that that potentially, I guess a gateway argument, that kids would take up vaping and then maybe go into smoking. So when we look at those figures of kids who haven't smoked as well, that kind of excludes kids who might have actually then who are smoking potentially after beginning to vape. I mean, how do we deal with that?
Yeah. Look, so the question of the gateway is an important one. So is vaping leading kids who would not otherwise have smoked to become regular smokers? Now, the answer to that is we now have pretty good evidence that it's not. So, yes, of course, there'll be the odd one who may progress that way, who mightn't have smoked. But overall, we're finding that vaping's diverting kids away from smoking. So in countries like New Zealand and the US, the UK, as vaping rates have gone up in kids, smoking rates have fallen faster. So they've accelerated downwards. So kids are trying vaping, doing it for a while, then stopping, and rarely progressing to smoking. And some kids who would have smoked are going to vaping instead. And the number of kids smoking is falling faster. So, the whole gateway theory, which was always, it's always pulled out when there's a new threat, like it was with marijuana and so on.
Yeah.
And history shows that, in fact, that it doesn't hold true. Kids who try vaping are more likely to smoke, but they're also more likely to try alcohol and other drugs and other risky behaviours because they're risk-taking kids. But it's not vaping that causes them to take up those behaviours.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a correlation versus causation.
Yeah,
question,
exactly.
yeah.
It's a marker for risk-taking. It's not a causal factor in smoking, take up of smoking.
I guess, yeah, and maybe the dilemma that a lot of people are facing when we think about this, and conversations that I've had with friends, like particularly I remember a conversation I had with a friend of mine who's a teacher and supports a harm reduction approach and doesn't think prohibition works, but also I guess we worry about, how do we ensure that we're communicating to kids that there are potential risks of vaping. We're not, communicating this idea that vaping is totally safe and why not just give it a crack, because we just don't know necessarily the long-term impacts.
Well, you've raised a whole lot of issues there. One is, what do we tell kids? Well, I think what we tell them is that this is an adult quitting aid. It's for smokers who are adults who can't quit, and this is an aid to help them quit. We tell them it's not for kids. Kids shouldn't smoke or vape. We tell them it's not risk-free, but it's much safer than smoking. And we give them honest, accurate information without lies or fear-mongering or scare campaigns, because kids see through that. So basically what I'm saying is I think we need to give kids the facts without exaggeration, and they will make up their minds, hopefully with the correct information.
Because I think there's an argument, like we can present it as just a smoking cessation, like a quitting device for adults. But also, if we were going to be, if we're going to be real, it's also a recreational thing that, and we're saying it shouldn't necessarily just be available by prescription, even though it can be a helpful quitting device. But I guess my view, and I think a general harm reduction review in general when it comes to drugs should be that, some people are going to use them. Some people are going to use them recreationally, but you're not going to stop people using them by prohibiting them. And particularly,
exactly.
if we were, not that we're at the stage of proposing criminal penalties for use yet, but certainly shouldn't be going down that road.
And you raised the issue of long-term risk. This is always thrown up about vaping. And there's a whole lot of things to say about that. There's no question that long-term vaping will be far safer than smoking. When you consider that smoking has over 7,000 chemicals at high doses from burning tobacco, and vapor has on average about 100 chemicals, they're mostly less than 1% of what they are in smoke. It's clearly going to be a lot safer. And most of those levels are fairly negligible. So yes, there are heavy metals, there's formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, all these scary chemicals that you hear about, but they're at such low levels that they're mostly below the levels where there's a threshold, the threshold for causing harm. So just saying that there's chemicals in vapor is meaningless. You've got to assess the quantity and the overall toxicity. We constantly get this message, and it's constantly thrown at vapors and smokers and kids who don't vape, and it's a really exaggerated, misleading message.
Yeah, I'm thinking, and I know you saw this as well, because obviously I'm in Queensland and have sort of been following the Queensland government recently announced they would do this parliamentary inquiry into vaping. I mean, the framing is quite, it's so clearly sort of designed to play into a real kind of moral panic about we have no idea what's in vapes, and they kept saying specifically things like, we're going to find out what's in them, we're going to get to the bottom of it, and they have sampled 17. They've taken 17 samples. They did this media release about a week ago saying the results are in, and they've talked about, they've got formaldehyde, they've got carcinogens. The language, there was this one quote from that release that says a number of these heavy metals that they say they found in the samples are known to be carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic to reproduction and development, and cause neurological anomalies, which is terrifying, right? And of course, you're going to then get all these media articles about deadly, toxic vapes.
Grossly exaggerating.
Yeah, and it does sound scary. It's like, well, why do they have arsenic and lead and mercury and nickel and all of that? But
and what they don't say is there's arsenic in tap water, and there's heavy metals in. There was a study I looked at recently that described how there were all these heavy metals in baby food. There are toxins in the air we breathe. I mean, there's toxins and chemicals everywhere, and it's quite meaningless and very misleading just to say we found chemicals. Well, there's chemicals everywhere. So what? But are they harmful? And of course, it's better to breathe fresh air, which is still has its chemicals, admittedly, than anything else. But everything has some risk.
Yeah, they use this classic thing. I don't know if there's actually a term for this method, but it's so commonly used in these little factoids that you hear where you're like, oh, well, the ingredients in Coca-Cola, not that I'm saying Coca-Cola is good for you, but, it's the same as what's in dishwashing, or it's almost like that, humans share 99% of our DNA with a banana thing or something.
I mean, that is such a misleading emotional argument to say, we found chemicals in nail polish remover and insecticide.
Yeah,
what?
That are the same.
I mean, that doesn't mean the chemicals are what makes those products toxic. Just they found them there. They might have also found them in tap water. Does that mean we shouldn't drink tap water? I mean, that is really emotional and misleading. And unfortunately, this debate has been treated that way by a lot of public health people who are just trying to frighten the public against using these products.
Yeah. It's almost like, I think because it is like it's still something that is very new, and certainly use has like rapidly escalated. I think we've all noticed that. And there's this sudden scramble to figure out like how do we respond to this, and how do we we now have to do these massive public education campaigns, but the approach is pure just like fear and exaggeration, and I don't really know if that will work.
Exactly. And look, the public education campaigns from New South Wales Health, Victoria Health, WA Health and Queensland, they've all been very dishonest and misleading. And I've looked at them more carefully, and I've been, blown away by the misinformation that our elected officials are giving to people. They clearly have an agenda. They don't want people to use these products, and it's there's no stopping them from distorting the information they're providing. And I think that's quite disgraceful. I mean, you can give people the facts, and you can do it dispassionately and let them make up their own minds, and that's what they should be doing.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, though, even whether the agenda, like whether the motivation is necessarily to stop people using it. I mean, I'm sure there is kind of that. There's an element of good faith, but I think also it's just such a hot button political issue that governments want and need to be able to say that they are cracking down on vaping, something that I would say a lot of parents in particular are, really worried about. So it's very much
there's point.
A lot
more kudos in saying, we're fighting the tobacco companies and we're protecting the children, rather than we're helping old smokers to quit. That doesn't sort of sound sexy at all. So so there's a lot of political pressure as well. When you've got the Cancer Council and the AMA and the TGA and the College of Physicians all promoting this same line, it's very hard for the health minister, to be fair, to say, well, actually, you're wrong, and we've got to look at the bigger picture here, which is overall public health, which is clearly going to be improved by vaping. It's very hard for him to go against the pressure.
And this is where I think as well, I mean, I have found it hard to kind of get a handle on what the realities are around vaping and the evidence, because a lot of those organizations, the health bodies I would generally look to for the truth. And and I am very skeptical of the corporations and the fact that some big tobacco internationally in particular are swinging in behind deregulating or improving access to vaping. And so I'm like, well, these people that I don't trust are proposing this, but I actually kind of agree with them. It's kind of confusing, right?
It is creating an issue of people not trusting our authorities. I mean, the National Health and Medical Research Council is our peak medical and health research organisation, and they normally give very good advice. In the area of vaping, we did a review recently of their position statement. It was done by 4 Australian academics and 7 leading international researchers in this field. We published it in the leading journal Addiction. And it basically concluded that their statement was full of scientific errors, it contained misinformation and bias, and it wasn't fit to guide policy in Australia. And that's a damning critique. It was a peer-reviewed critique, and again by leading people, including the head of the Royal College of Physicians in the UK, the head author of Public Health England's reports, the leading nicotine specialist in the world, Professor Neil Benowitz, all reviewed this NHMRC. And normally we would just accept the NHMRC as gospel, and I always have. But when I looked at this, not just me, but other people have agreed. But unfortunately, it's a very political document. I think all these organisations have fallen into line. This is the narrative we're taking. We're going to find the information to confirm this narrative. And look, I understand why it's very hard for people to really understand what's happening. And then there's the argument, it's all a big tobacco conspiracy. Well, that settles it. Then we definitely can't trust anything that we're
certainly
hearing.
very low on the trust rating.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact is that not one of the products sold in Australia on the black market to kids is sold by big tobacco. Mark Butler says, this is just big tobacco packaging a new product, trying to hook our kids. They need the new customers. Not one of the products used by kids is made by big tobacco in Australia.
But presumably, they would like to be entering into the market in Australia. Sure. I'm sure they would love to. So they do have an interest in advocating for that.
They do. And they're in the market, in the legal market. So they have products that are regulated, that are high quality, that are available through pharmacies. But, of course, no one's using the pharmacy model. They can't do it the wrong way because they'll be hammered. Yeah. But, we're blaming them for this when... And again, I think that's a ploy to gain leverage for this argument rather than the truth, unfortunately, which has suffered terribly in this debate.
Yeah, there is surely kind of the position that I feel as though I'm landing at the moment, which is that, I think probably there are big evil corporations, including in the tobacco industry, who do have a vested interest in changing government regulations so that they can get their product to consumers more readily. Yeah. And, I think particularly a lot of the evidence around, I think around harms is unsettled. As you say, we don't necessarily know yet, sure, we don't know what the impacts are going to be in 10 years. But at the same time, the kind of reactionary, or, the approach that is driven by, fear and a prohibitionist approach that's not necessarily the right way to deal with that. I am curious, around the evidence around vaping as a smoking cessation device is also still a little unclear to me. And I'm curious your take on this, because there's some studies that show that most smokers who do take up vaping continue to smoke. Whereas I've heard from other folks, even anecdotally, I hope our producer Mike doesn't mind me saying this, but just before he was saying that vaping helped him smoke, so helped him quit smoking. So
the answer to that is it's beyond any reasonable doubt that vaping is the most effective quitting aid we've got. So it doesn't work for everyone, but there's a Colin review, which is the highest level of evidence for proving that a treatment works. And they've looked at randomized controlled trials. They concluded there's high quality evidence. But that's in the randomized controlled trials. But there's been lots of other supportive evidence from population studies, observational studies, real world studies that show in the real world, without support, it also works. And so when you bring all that together with what's called triangulation, which means using different types of studies with different settings, with different strengths and weaknesses, it's clear cut that vaping is an effective quitting aid and probably the most effective.
Not perfect, but perfect. It's a significant health issue, and if it's going to help.
We're talking about a really difficult condition to treat, and if we can double the success rate, we have the potential to save millions of lives.
Yeah, that's right. So what do you think, can you outline basically the model that you and other folks working in this space would be pushing for, that, what an evidence-based harm reduction model would look like to regulating vaping?
Yeah. So what we would recommend is what's being used in other Western countries. So it's nothing unusual or made up. It's what's actually being used. So the idea is that vaping is a consumer product for adults. It's for adults who are otherwise unable to quit smoking, and it's a substitute for cigarettes. It's a substitute for deadly cigarettes. So it's a form of harm reduction. It's a better way of getting nicotine without the poisons, and it's a much safer alternative. So the idea is that would be available just like cigarettes are to adult smokers with strict age verification from licensed retail outlets. So they're readily accessible, at least as accessible as cigarettes. So from convenience stores, vape shops, supermarkets where they sell cigarettes. And adults have a choice then to use the safer alternative or the deadly one. And that model's working well overseas, and that's what we'd like to see in Australia. And, with that, you can introduce even harsher age restrictions. You can have CCTV for purchases. You need harsh penalties for underage sales, loss of license for breaches of age sales. Lots of ways to enforce, age restrictions. But it's just a matter of recognising that it's absurd to allow deadly cigarettes to be available at every corner shop, but for people to have to jump through hoops to get hold of a much safer alternative to help them quit.
Yeah, I think that's helpful that you outlined some of the additional things that could be put in place to enable enforcement, because what I was thinking was, you get people on board with saying that, okay, maybe we should, legalize and regulate access so that we can actually have greater regulation of these products instead of this big black market. But then it's also like, well, if these stores that are selling black market vapes at the moment are effectively operating with impunity, how would that change if we, because they're selling vapes that have nicotine in them right now when they're theoretically not meant to be able to. So how do we actually stop that from happening if we did have a fully regulated model?
So you definitely, convenience stores and tobacconists are selling these products. There's no enforcement. There's millions of these products coming across the border. There's so much money to be made, they can't help themselves. You need a license to sell these products, and then you need some enforcement. So if you sell to a kid, you have a huge penalty and you lose your license. It's interesting that we're so obsessed with that when we don't worry about that with cigarettes. We say, you just show me are you 18? Yes, here's your cigarettes.
Well, and there is a strong black market for cigarettes, for tobacco, as I understand it, actually.
As well. But we sell them legally with very little restriction. But we're saying, well, if we're going to sell vapes, we've got to have all these extra precautions so kids can't get them. But we don't do that with cigarettes, which is what actually is going to kill them.
Yeah. And yet, and then there's kind of, there have been these other proposals. I think federally, even just this week, they were talking about banning menthol cigarettes, for example, and putting, individual warnings on cigarettes. Similarly, some folks have pushed for, in addition to like plain packaging and a ban on advertising vapes, banning flavors as well. But I know that you say that actually wouldn't be a good step in terms of a harm reduction approach. Why is that?
Look, the research. There's a lot of research on flavors now. First of all, we know that it's a major contributor to smokers switching to vaping. It's a part of the appeal. It's an integral part of the appeal of vaping, and we want smokers to quit by switching to vaping. So that's the first thing. Less of them are going to do it. Secondly, when you remove the flavors, the research shows with kids, for example, yes, fewer of them will vape, but more of them will smoke. And that's the same with adults as well. When you take away the flavors, people go back to, they say, well, why would I'll just go back to my cigarettes? Yeah. Or I'll change to a different product, or I'll get them on the black market. So there are ways around it.
Yeah.
And as far as kids go, flavors aren't why kids vape. Kids like flavours, but so do adults.
Well, yeah, we were talking about this. It's like adults can't enjoy flavours.
That's right. And in two large surveys in the US and the UK, two official surveys, they found that flavours was the third reason that kids vape. They either vape because peer pressure, they vape because of curiosity, and yes, they like the flavours. Yeah. So removing the flavours isn't going to help. It's going to mean more people keep smoking, and it's probably not going to make a big difference to kids vaping. They'll probably just get them on the black market if they want to anyway.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, that was a really interesting chat. I think I'll probably let you go. I know you're going overseas tomorrow, so I'm sure you've got lots of preparations to do. Don't want to hold you up for much longer. But are there any other things that people should look at, ways that people can keep up to date with the work that you're doing? Anything to plug?
Look, I think modestly, the best up-to-date source of information is on my website. So I write blogs regularly as new issues come out. So I think people will find that helpful. I happen to have written a book called Stop Smoking, Start Vaping, if I could just throw a quick plug in for that, which provides a full overview of this topic and all the evidence. But certainly you won't find much accurate information in Australia otherwise. There's a very good website from the New Zealand government which gives accurate information called New Zealand Vaping Facts.nz, I think it is. And that's that. And there's good information from the UK as well, from some of the NHS and other government websites. But there's not much available in Australia. And most of what people will read in Australia is alarmist and exaggerated and very misleading. It just follows the narrative, which is that, vaping is bad. And it's just the information they provide to support that is very misleading.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, thanks for the work that you're doing, even despite being labelled a big tobacco shill consistently. I found it really helpful to kind of cut through some of this stuff and learn a bit more about it recently. So hopefully it was helpful for our listeners too. Thanks again for coming on the show, Colin.
Thanks for having me, Emerald.
Serious danger to Australia.